still conquering America.
You tell him, Tracy. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. 21 minutes past the hour. Program brought to you in part by the Teamsters, proud supporters of the Employee Free Choice Act. You can find out more information at their website at teamster.org. This is a comment posted on our message board over at thomhartmann.com. Sometime on Thursday or Friday, you said, let's see, who posted this? Patty, P-A-D-D-Y. You said you would like to see the Reagan tax cuts repealed. Do you really want the marginal tax rates to return to 70%? That's what they were in the 1970s. Add to that state income tax, property tax, sales tax. The person could be paying over 80% of his income in taxes. Not much of an incentive to work, innovate, and take risks. If you will remember, the period between 1966 and 1982 saw the stock market go nowhere, inflation reached 12%, and unemployment was high throughout that period. That is the classic right-wing talking point, and it is almost all wrong. First of all, yes, I want to see the Reagan tax cuts repealed. And here's the kicker word, and I'm surprised, I'm guessing that this person, whoever posted this, actually is a right-wing shill because they're using the correct language, but they're using it in a way that the average person doesn't understand. They say, do you really want to see the marginal tax rates return to 70%? Well, but that word marginal is the critical word. It doesn't mean the overall tax rate. It doesn't mean that if you earn $50,000 a year, you're going to pay 70% tax. You're not. If you earn $50,000 a year, you're going to pay probably less than you are now, because people earning over $3 million a year are going to pay more than they are now. Because it's the marginal rates, the rates at the margin, the rates at the fringe, the rates at the very, very top that are going to go up. The rates on the top 0.1% of Americans. That income tax rate goes up. Now, the argument that is made for why, again, everything stays the same unless you're making over $3 million a year. If you're making over $3 million a year, yep, your income tax rate goes to 70%. And yep, you may not have an incentive to work that much harder or that much more, innovate that much more. But you tell me, do you really think anybody making over $3 million a year needs an incentive to innovate more? First of all, what I've found in all my years in business, and they've been considerable, for better or for worse, is that people work because they love their work. I started a number of companies over the years, and typically the first couple of years of running the business, I made nothing, zero. And then, down the road, you sell the business, or in the last couple of years that I owned them, I made a lot. I was in that top 0.1% on a couple of occasions. And it made no difference. I was working because I loved what I was doing. I loved building the business. And when you cash out, you cash out, if you do. Or if you're making $3.2 million, what's wrong with saying as a nation, $3 million a year, that's enough. Somebody can't live on that, they got a problem. And no, we really don't want somebody having an incentive to earn more than that. We'd rather have a whole bunch of people have an incentive to earn $50, $100, $150, $200,000 a year and provide room for that by capping taxes at $3.2 million a year. We were doing just fine, thank you very much, back in the golden age of the American middle class. Now, this person is dissing the period from the 60s through the 70s. Let's see, the period from 66 to 82. Well, first of all, very selective, because 82 was the year that the stock market crashed under Reagan. And 66, not such a great year. But if you take the period from 1960, take the period from 1950 to 2000, and just look at each decade, what you find is that the decade of the 80s, the Reagan decade, had the slowest growth of any of those 4 decades. The decades of this, and by the way, the middle class lost the most, particularly after that tax cut on the top marginal rate. And the decade of the 90s, the middle class lost out terribly. The middle class went in the tank in the decade of the 90s. So rather than selectively picking years, 66 through 82, let's just look at all these decades. In the 50s, you had spectacular growth of the middle class. And you had a top marginal tax rate of 91% in the 50s. In the 60s, you had a top marginal tax rate through 64 of 91%. In 64, it dropped down to 74%. In the 70s did fairly well if you look at the entire decade, if you don't just take the last couple of years when the bill came due for Vietnam. The 70s, the growth of GDP, job growth, the whole thing. Any way you look at it, you take the entire decade of the 70s and compare it to the entire decade of the 80s, which was almost entirely Reagan. The 70s was better. The 80s was the bad decade. Between Reagan's crash in 82 and the stock market crash in 87, you had some pretty, and that's, of course, why this guy is cutting off at 82, you had some pretty bad years. The decade of the 80s was really rough on Americans. The 90s did a whole lot better under Bill Clinton. We were back more or less to the kind of job growth that we saw in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And the first decade of 2000 under George W. Bush was just as bad as that under Reagan. As Paul Krugman pointed out, there's basically been no wealth created since George Bush became president. Now, hopefully that'll change. We have a Democrat in the White House again. Go back and look over the last 200 years. What you see, or the last 150 years anyway, what you see is when Democrats are in the White House and they control Congress, the economy grows, jobs grow, the middle class grows. When Republicans control the show, the rich grow, everybody else gets screwed. It's really very simple.